Let's talk about modernism. I'm going to do my very best to take some very, very complicated terms and make them simple. I'm sure I'm going to leave some things out. I'm sure there's going to be some people that are going to say I did not speak with the precision that I should have. But I'm doing my very best for, let's say, non-philosophers to understand what I'm trying to say about, what the church is trying to say about modernism and why it's bad. So why is modernism bad? The church condemned modernism with an encyclical called Pascendi Dominici Gregis in 1907, and it is absolutely worth the read. I will put the link to that document in the notes. I'll put a link to another document which was like a syllabus of errors called Lamentabili Sane, also written in 1997 by Pope Pius X. 1907 by Pope Pius X. And if you have the time and the inclination, worth the read. But what I'm going to try to do here in this video is just make it a little bit more simple to understand ways in which modernism might be infecting the way that we think without us even knowing it, right? So it's going to be simplified, compact, but here we go. First of all, the modern period is a time period, right? So all kinds of different thoughts, all kinds of different philosophies and theologies come up during this time. So it's not like you have one univocal way of thinking during the modern period, but there are some sort of philosophies that take root in the way a whole lot of people think, these prevailing thoughts in philosophy and in theology that happen during a certain period of time. I'm going to mark the time of modernity between the end of the Renaissance, right? The end of the Renaissance, which is like the beginning of the Enlightenment, let's call it, all the way up until the postmodern period, which is a lot more recent, and I'll explain why. So the modern period begins with the Enlightenment. All of these new philosophies come out that begin to blossom, where people begin to really believe a lot more in the human ability to think its way through problems. Like we can solve a lot of our problems by philosophizing about it, by maybe even coming up with some social theory, right? The Enlightenment is really big into the sciences, like we can figure out the world. We have the capacity to do some things that we've never thought of before. And that's going to not always fit all that well with religion, okay? So here's how it all rolls out. First, there is this sense of what we'll call rationalism, right? Rationalism is related to being rational, and being rational is good, right? You have a rational faculty, an ability to think about the world and understand it. To be rational is good. But rationalism is when we say everything about the world can be known if we just think about it hard enough, apply enough of a good intellect. A good intellect plus lots of time should be able to understand the whole world. We can figure out and know the entire world in our minds. René Descartes, who was a Catholic, is a pretty big figure during, for this rationalism, right? René Descartes, you might know the name Descartes from the Cartesian grid in geometry, where René Descartes says, we can understand the whole world if we just map it out into these kind of like mathematical terms, right? So we can know the whole world on the X, Y, and the Z axis. We can know it all and like contain it in our minds almost, right? We should doubt all of these ancient sort of like received forms of wisdom that we can't really figure out. They're so mysterious. We should instead say the less mysterious it is, the more important it is that we know it and the better it is. We should question everything so that we can kind of arrive in our minds at this grasp of all that there is to know. Rationalism says we have a lot of belief in that project. Be rational, that's good, but rationalism runs into problems with the church, right? The church and good theology is going to understand that God is more than our minds can ever handle, right? God is so much more than anything our minds can handle. And so rationalism sort of competes with Catholic theology that way. Sort of the other side of rationalism is empiricism. Empiricism says if we measure everything, if we sense it, if we experience it, if we come to know the world through our sensible experiences, that's the best way to know it. We're not going to think our way through the world. We're going to measure our way through the world. So you hear people sometimes say, show me the empirical data, right? The way in which we've gathered up all of these measurements and we compare them and understand the world that way better. That's not so bad. It's not so bad to like want to measure the world. It's not bad to, to think empirically, right? But empiricism says that that's all there is. If you can't measure it, if you can't weigh it, if you can't compare it to other things in the world, you're not really knowing the world anymore. You're talking about a bunch of woo-woo stuff that is uninteresting to the modern mind, right? That's obviously going to be hostile to elements of the faith, which cannot be measured. I mean, how do you measure love? How do you measure sacrifice? How do you measure justice? How do you measure, the knowledge of a supreme being who is, right? How do you submit all of that to your measurements of it? You're gonna have a hard time. You're gonna have a pretty hard time. So empiricism is going to be a little bit hostile to the faith, and in some ways, it kind of clashes with rationalism. But somehow these things coexist in the modern period. Then you have humanism. Think like Voltaire, right? A lot of talk about human rights and above all, these different human freedoms and everything. As long as human rights are good, right? So human freedom is good. Like you need a space to be able to practice virtue, right? But human freedom, according to Voltaire, is much more about putting the human being at the top of the heap. And we are at the top of the heap in some ways. God put us there, right? God made us the highest of these, in the world that we know and we experience in the world. God has us as the best kind of being there is out there. But humanism at its worst is whenever we say there's no more like idea above us. There's nothing that should control us. It should be us that control everything else. It should be us that we take our rights as human beings beyond what is good or bad. We don't ask what's good or bad. We ask what we have a right to do. And you should never infringe upon my rights. And I won't infringe upon your rights. And of course we know this is the world we live in, right? So bad people do bad things, and rights sometimes conflict, and there are all kind of ways in which a sort of a strict humanism doesn't quite get you there. But modernism sort of has a great hope in humanism. There's also a sense of pragmatism. Like ideas serve, it's good to be pragmatic, right? But in pragmatism, you say that all of these thoughts and all of these philosophies and all that stuff, we really are going to take those and subordinate them to us and our needs. My desire to have the world be a better place is only going to be, I can only make it better using these ideas and these concepts. They are at the service of me and of whatever goal I'm aiming at. But they themselves aren't really and truly above me. In fact, they are below me. They become a tool that I use rather than something above me that helps me know how I should be behaving. I instead use them as a tool to fix my problems in the world. Pragmatism, okay? So again, good, not bad to be pragmatic sometimes, right? It's kind of good, but to be to understand your goal in the world and to try to reach it in a very practical sense. But pragmatism itself subordinates a lot of things that really should be above us, okay? So that's pragmatism. The modern period really is marked by a lot of hopefulness in these new isms, these new ways of thinking, which are really not that new, but they're definitely taken to the extreme during this period, that we submit our religion to it because we're so hopeful in it. We're so much more hopeful in these modern ways of thinking, that all the good things they can do for us. And in fact, look what they've done for us. Technologically speaking, we can now get way more out of farmland than we used to get out of farmland. Now we can travel, oceans, great distances in our ships. Now we have trains that can transport goods left and right. Now we have all kinds of new ways that they're thinking this, new ways of communicating with one another. So there's just a lot of hope during the modern period. And really it's a hope in humanity's ability without God, without need of God, certainly without need of the fetters of religion, the chains of religion. We can cast those off and we can really do better now that religion isn't holding us back in some kind of way. That's kind of the modern hope. That ends, we're now in the postmodern age, that really ends with the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? That's the way I see it, at least. I think people began to pretty quickly lose hope in all of this technology, pretty quickly lose hope in all of these, social sciences and pragmatism and rationalism and empiricism, pretty much lose hope. They don't stop using these things, but they lose hope in it when they see that we basically took all of these tools and these advancements and these ways in which we should be made better, and we used it to kill each other. We used it to kill each other in war. And, without getting into whether or not, one war was just or over another war or anything like that, we did as the human race sort of lose hope in those things in a way that we hadn't lost hope before the dropping of those bombs. So we now live in the postmodern period, which totally deserves its own video. There are new ways of thinking now that are beyond the things I just mentioned. But many of us do still live thinking in those terms of rationalism, of pragmatism, of empiricism. Some of us still think in those ways without even thinking about it. We approach the world kind of armored up with some of those things that the Enlightenment brought us, that the Industrial Revolution brought us, and it's going to ultimately be hostile to the faith. It's ultimately going to cause problems. So I hope this video was helpful. I hope it helps you sort of think about the way that you approach the world and maybe see some of the ways in which the solutions that the world has offered might not be all of the solutions that you're looking for. Amen.